Cowboys who think combat experience trumps hospital protocol. That was what Dr. Sterling had written on the unit board 3 weeks ago, his words aimed at Margaret Walsh like a sniper round through plate glass. He had no idea she'd actually heard them. She always heard everything, the way operatives do, the way you learn to listen when silence means survival. He had no idea that the trembling hands he saw wrapping the stethoscope weren't nerves. They were restraint. Margaret moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU at 2:07 a.m., her steps quiet against sterile tile, the fluorescent lights overhead casting shadows the color of old bruises. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in bed 4. The heart monitor beeped its steady reassurance in bed 2. Everything was exactly as it should be at this hour, the world asleep, the machines awake, the night shift skeleton crew moving like ghosts between charts and vital signs. She adjusted the faded unit patch sewn deep inside her jacket lining before hanging it in her locker. SEAL Team 3 insignia, barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She wasn't. No one at Oak Creek Memorial was looking for anything about Margaret Walsh except maybe why she kept her head down, why she worked nights, why she never mentioned a family or a life before Denver. 15 months she'd been here. 15 months of anonymity, which was exactly the point. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked the 4 line on the patient in bed 6, a post-op colostomy, stable, snoring softly under the covers. The tremor wasn't new. It had started in Kandahar, in a converted shipping container they'd used as a surgical suite, during the explosion that sent shrapnel through 2 layers of body armor and left her with nerve damage in her left shoulder and a medical discharge from the Navy. Pain was information. The shaking was just her nervous system remembering that it had almost stopped working entirely. Dr. Sterling's polished shoes clicked against the tile at 2:14 a.m. Margaret heard him before she saw him, the sound arrived first, always, and she didn't look up from the medication log she was charting. His presence made the air pressure change, that quality of atmospheric shift that came from someone who believed he occupied more space than his body actually took up. 43 years old, 3 degrees from Ivy League schools, appointed surgical director of the ICU through careful networking with hospital board members who played tennis with his father-in-law. He glanced at her the way someone glances at a floor they're deciding whether to mop. "Graveyard shift suits you, Margaret," he said, and she knew without looking that he hadn't meant it as a compliment. His tone was the sonic equivalent of a smile that showed teeth but no warmth. "Quiet. Out of the way. Everyone's better off that way." She continued charting. The pen moved. The numbers appeared. Her voice, when it came, was soft and carefully modulated. "Yes, doctor." He nodded, satisfied with her deference, and moved toward the supply room where he'd left a coffee he'd forgotten about for hours ago. Sterling did that, left things behind, assumed someone else would clean them up, moved forward without accounting for what he'd destroyed in his wake. He was a man who believed that authority and competence were the same thing, and the ICU at Oak Creek Memorial had learned to let him believe it. Margaret finished her charting. She checked bed 4 again. The patient there was still stable, still resting, still unaware that his life was about to become a crucible. She walked to the small window that looked out over Denver at this hour, which meant looking out over darkness and the occasional amber streetlight. Somewhere out there, past the mountain she could barely see, there were places where people still died in her hands and she did the work anyway. Places where there was no Dr. Sterling, no bureaucratic permission slips, no hierarchy of competence based on who had the right last name. Here, there was just the clock and the rulebook and the weight of knowing how to do something that you weren't officially allowed to do. The trauma alert came through at 2:36 a.m. The radio crackled. "Incoming, Marine Sergeant Major, multiple GSWs from Kandahar, 9 penetrating wounds, currently en route via military transport, ETA for minutes." The ICU transformed. Beds cleared. Equipment mobilized. The crash cart moved into position like a chess piece in a game no one wanted to play. Nurses came in from break rooms and supply closets. The fluorescent light seemed to brighten, or maybe it was just that everyone's pupils dilated in unison, that collective adrenaline spike that turned civilians into soldiers for the next however long it took. Margaret's breathing changed. One measured inhale. Exhale. Her hand stopped trembling. It was like someone had switched a circuit breaker in her spine, and the damaged nerve endings remembered their purpose. Kandahar. The name landed in her chest like a fist. Not the city she'd left, but the war she'd come to Denver to forget. Dr. Sterling emerged from his coffee break with the coffee still in his hand, and his authority reasserted itself immediately. This was his domain. These were his rules. He took the lead on the initial briefing. 9 penetrating wounds meant multiple potential complications, meant internal hemorrhage assessment, meant the kind of triage thinking that required 18 years of surgical experience and the confidence that came from knowing your name was on the hospital letterhead. The sergeant major arrived on a military stretcher, his uniform dark with blood that had dried to the color of old rust. Margaret had seen this before, she'd seen this dozens of times, had operated under these exact conditions, had held viscera in place while another medic pushed fluids and a third person prayed. The Marines with him, a corpsman and 2 combat medics, moved with the economy of motion that came from having done this in places with actual mortar fire in the background. Bay 1, Sterling said, and the controlled chaos began. Margaret moved to the sergeant major's side as they transferred him to the hospital gurney. Her eyes assessed the entry wounds, the trajectory predictions, the color of his skin, the quality of his breathing. His lungs weren't exchanging air properly on the right side. The breathing was shallow, compensatory, wrong. The machines detected it, oxygen saturation at 88% and falling. Sterling was moving fast, his hands already working through the initial assessment. Abdomen, rigid. Chest, diminished breath sounds on the right side. His eyes tracked up to the monitor as the oxygen continued its descent. 84% now. The 4 was running, but fluid replacement was meaningless if the lungs weren't oxygenating the blood. He ordered a chest X-ray. He ordered labs. Standard protocol. Necessary but slow, and the oxygen kept falling. Margaret stepped closer to the monitor. She watched the pattern, watched the breathing, watched the way the patient's chest rose unequally. Tension pneumothorax. The diagnosis arrived in her mind like a memory instead of a new thought. Air was in the pleural space, building pressure, collapsing the lung, pushing everything sideways. Every breath the sergeant major took was making it worse. The O2 sat dropped to 79. She moved to the equipment tray. Her hands knew where to go before her conscious mind finished forming the decision. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Chlorhexidine wipe. The procedure was muscle memory from 12 years of naval surgical support, from operations conducted in shipping containers and desert facilities and forward operating bases without names, in places where waiting for a chest X-ray meant watching someone die in front of you. His developing tension pneumothorax, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. Right side. Needs immediate decompression. Sterling looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has just stepped outside the fence and started running toward enemy territory. His face registered the violation of hierarchy first, that she had spoken without permission, that she had made a diagnosis without authorization, that she had suggested a procedure outside the scope of a nurse's practice. But his patient's oxygen was at 76, and falling, and Margaret was already prepping the site with practiced efficiency, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her movements the product of 1,000 training hours he couldn't see. If you're going to do this, Sterling said coldly, you're doing it under my explicit authorization, and you're doing it now. It wasn't a request. It was a command, issued because he had no choice, issued in a tone that made clear he would extract a price for the decision later. Margaret didn't acknowledge the permission. She didn't need to. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and the needle slid through skin and muscle and pleural membrane like it was traveling through a map it had memorized. The hiss of air escaping, sudden, unmistakable, the sound of pressure equalizing, was the most honest sound in the room. The monitor responded. Oxygen climbed. 78, 82, 88, 92. The sergeant major's breathing deepened, became symmetrical, became functional. His body released tension that had been accumulating since the moment the bullets found him in Kandahar. Get him to OR, Sterling said, and the team moved, but his eye stayed on Margaret for exactly 2 seconds longer than was professional. Those 2 seconds contained a conversation. Those 2 seconds meant the debt was due. The next 2 hours were controlled crisis. The sergeant major went to surgery. Sterling led the team with the competence Margaret had grudgingly acknowledged. Whatever else he could operate. Margaret returned to the ICU, to the monitors and the charting and the quiet work of keeping machines running while surgeons did the dramatic work upstairs. At 5:13 a.m., the sergeant major came back to the ICU post-op, stable, sedated, his internal bleeding addressed and repaired, the crisis managed. Sterling emerged from surgery wearing the expression of someone who had won a battle and expected recognition for it. Margaret was updating the monitor settings when he called her into the hallway. The unit board was a whiteboard near the nursing station where Sterling posted updates and, occasionally, warnings. Public place. Visible to families and residents and other attending physicians. He uncapped a marker with the deliberate care of someone performing a ritual. Needle decompression, 2:19 a.m., he wrote. Then, underneath, performed by RN Margaret Walsh without physician approval. Scope violation. Unauthorized procedure. This behavior will not be tolerated. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives in hospitals when something has been said that changes the immediate future. The family of the sergeant major was in the waiting room, and one of them emerged, his sister, Margaret learned later, and read the board. Her face shifted through confusion toward anger. Did my brother die because someone did something they weren't supposed to? She asked, her voice the quality of someone who had already survived worse news and was bracing for more. Your brother is alive because someone knew what they were doing, Sterling said smoothly. But hospital protocol exists for a reason, and we maintain standards regardless of outcome. The sister looked at Margaret. Margaret met her gaze with the expression of someone who had learned not to defend herself. Composure. Quiet dignity. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Sterling dismissed her with a gesture that was almost courteous. Go back to work, return to invisibility, understand what has just happened to your career trajectory in this institution. The break room at 5:11 a.m. smelled like old coffee and the particular staleness that accumulates in spaces where people process their emotions without speaking about them. Margaret poured herself a cup from the pot that had been sitting on the warmer for approximately 6 hours, and the smell of it, bitter, almost chemical, was the sensory anchor for what came next. 3 nurses were there. Samantha from the evening shift, running late. Derek, who'd been at Oak Creek for 4 years and wanted nothing more than an uncomplicated professional existence. Patricia, who had always been kind in a distant way that meant she didn't want complications either. They had their coffee. They were checking their phones. They were minding their business. When Margaret sat down in the worn chair by the window, the room shifted. Samantha glanced at Patricia. Patricia glanced at Derek. The conversation that hadn't existed for the 45 seconds before Margaret arrived seemed suddenly urgent. I'm heading out, Samantha said. Morning shift tomorrow. Yeah, I should check on the patient in bed 3, Patricia added. Derek just stood up, and the 3 of them moved out of the room in a choreography that was clearly not spontaneous, that had clearly been practiced many times with other people who had violated Sterling's standards, who had done something outside the acceptable range of invisibility. The silence after they left was louder than anything that had been said aloud. Margaret sat alone with her coffee, the bitter, chemical, wrong-tasting coffee, and understood that she had crossed a line in an institution where the lines were written in invisible ink that only Sterling was allowed to see. She had saved a Marine's life using 12 years of surgical expertise, and the cost of the decision was being quantified in the form of professional isolation in a break room at 5:27 a.m. in Denver. She took one sip of the coffee. She didn't finish it. She set the cup down on the edge of the table and returned to the ICU, where the sergeant major was sleeping, where the monitors were steady, where the work continued in the spaces between Sterling's authority and the actual practice of keeping human beings alive. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next, in the hours and days that would follow, the systematic undermining, the phone calls Sterling would make, the investigation he would launch into her credentials, The questions that would begin to arrive from hospital administration about her references and her qualifications and why exactly someone with her supposed skills was working night shift at a mid-tier hospital in Denver instead of anywhere else in the United States. The worst part was that Sterling had no idea that he had just made an enemy of someone who had already survived places that most people couldn't imagine, and she had learned in those places that enemies were sometimes the only kind of motivation that actually worked. The sergeant major's eyes flickered open at 0347, his pupils tracking toward the window where Denver's pre-dawn was still black as a closed fist. Margaret was checking his chest tube drainage, 300 milliliters since shift change, a good number, a healing number, when his voice came through the oxygen mask, barely audible, rougher than gravel. That decomp, he rasped. Only saw medics do it that clean in Helmand. Margaret's hand stilled on the fall line. She didn't turn. Every muscle in her body understood what was happening, recognition, the kind that comes from surviving the same hell together, from watching the same sky explode into fire. The kind of recognition that ended careers. But when she turned to face him, her composure was already in place. One measured breath. Just one. His eyes were still tracking hers, waiting. The morphine had softened his edges but not the intelligence behind his gaze. A man who had commanded Marines under fire, who had survived 6 IED blasts and 2 RPG strikes, didn't miss the way someone moved. Didn't miss the efficiency. The economy of motion. The bone-deep knowledge of what a body needed to live when everything was trying to kill it. Margaret met his gaze, held it for a full 3 seconds, longer than protocol allowed, longer than safety dictated, and said simply, "You're stable now. That's what matters." She reached for his chart, her hand steady as surgical steel, and a single tear escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, not breaking eye contact, not flinching, not retreating. The tear itself was the only thing she allowed. The only piece of her armor that had cracked in that moment. The sergeant major watched her return to her charts, his hand still reaching for where her wrist had been, his lips forming words he was too sedated to speak. But his eyes said everything. Recognition. Understanding. The terrible, burning weight of secrets shared only by people who had stood on the edge of an abyss together. Margaret finished documenting his vitals at the bedside, her handwriting perfect, each number recorded with clinical precision. She had learned long ago that bearing witness to truth didn't require acknowledgement. That survival didn't require explanation. That sometimes the greatest act of mercy was to never speak what you both already knew. What she didn't know was that Dr. Sterling had been standing in the doorway for the last 30 seconds. He had come to the ICU at 0345 to review the sergeant major's labs, a habit of control, checking on his patients at odd hours as if constant vigilance proved his superiority. But he had stopped in the doorway when he heard the patient's voice. Had watched the exchange between Margaret and the Marine. Had seen her tears, her steadiness, the way the patient looked at her like she had just given him his life back a second time. And in that moment, standing in the darkened hallway with the ventilators humming their mechanical rhythm behind him, Dr. Sterling understood something with absolute clarity: he had made a mistake. Not with his initial assessment of the Marine. Sterling's diagnostic skills were sound, he had assessed tension pneumothorax, he had ordered imaging, he had been competent in his way. But Margaret had beaten him to it. Margaret had acted before he could order action. Margaret had saved the patient before he could be the one to save him. That had been 4 days ago. Since then, the sergeant major had recovered steadily. His lung had re-expanded. His oxygen saturation had climbed to 96%. The family had taken to sitting in the waiting area, the wife bringing flowers, the daughters asking for Margaret by name when they came for their evening visits. "Is our nurse here?" they asked. Not "Is the doctor here?" Not "Where is Dr. Sterling?" They asked for Margaret. And Sterling had watched this, day by day, the recognition growing that his authority in the ICU was being quietly undermined by a woman who wore scrubs 2 sizes too large and spoke in whispers and seemed to exist primarily to follow his orders, never to overshadow them. But that had changed 4 days ago when Margaret's hands moved faster than his, when her knowledge of field medicine had proved superior to his hospital medicine, when she had done something he would never be able to do in his carefully pressed suits and his perfectly cultivated network of hospital board members and his meticulously maintained reputation as the surgeon director who ran a tight ship, who controlled every variable, who was never, ever, second-guessed. 3 weeks before the sergeant major's arrival, Margaret had gently corrected Sterling's medication order during rounds. A small thing. A microdose discrepancy that could have caused complications. She had said it quietly, deferentially, her hand on his arm. "Doctor, I think that dose might be high for renal clearance." One hospital board member had been standing 5 feet away. One board member who would have noted that Sterling had made an error. One board member who would carry that observation into the next board meeting, the next conversation, the next moment when Sterling's competence came up in discussion. He had overridden her suggestion anyway. The patient had been fine. But the seed had been planted. The board member had looked at Sterling differently after that. Not with the kind of deference he had cultivated over 23 years. With the kind of look that suggested he might, possibly, be fallible. And then Margaret had performed the needle decompression, and Sterling's authority had cracked like plaster. Now, standing outside the sergeant major's room at 0350 in the morning, watching Margaret move through post-op rounds with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, Sterling felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: fear. Not of the hospital administration. Not of the board members. But of becoming irrelevant. Of being revealed as less than essential. Of being replaced by someone who could do what he did, only better, only faster, only with a humility that made patients trust her more than they trusted him. He had spent 23 years building his fiefdom. He had called in favors from administrators. He had mentored junior surgeons who owed him their positions. He had cultivated relationships with every influential person within 3 hospital systems. His name was spoken with respect in the surgical community. His papers were published. His innovations were credited to him, even the ones that had come from the quiet observations of nurses he had later dismissed or reassigned or pushed out for knowing too much. But Margaret Walsh was different. Margaret Walsh had done something that couldn't be explained by luck or quick thinking. She had performed a procedure with the precision of someone who had done it 40 times. 50 times. 100 times. Someone who had learned it not in a simulation lab but in actual combat, with actual blood, with actual lives depending on her hands being faster and steadier and more knowledgeable than anyone else in the room. That kind of knowledge couldn't be faked. It couldn't be taught in a 1-week course. It couldn't be acquired in a hospital where patients were sedated and monitors did half the thinking for you. It could only be acquired by someone who had been there. Someone who had actually lived it. And that terrified him more than anything in his entire career. Sterling returned to his office at 0430 and sat in the dark, his hands folded on the desk, his mind already working through the possibilities. He could reassign her. Move her to post-op permanently, away from the ICU, away from his patients, away from anyone important. He could document her unauthorized procedure formally with hospital administration. He could request that her credentials be reviewed. He could suggest, subtly, carefully, through the right channels, that someone with her background might have gaps in her training, might have taken shortcuts, might not be entirely trustworthy with the hospital's most critical patients. He could make phone calls. He had people who answered his calls. Board members who owed him. References at the temp agency where she had been placed. Questions to ask about her qualifications, her background, her previous positions. Seeds of doubt planted in the right ears. Systematic, careful, strategic, not the crude public humiliation he had already delivered, but something far more damaging. Something that would unravel her quietly, methodically, until she had no choice but to leave. That was the power he still had. Not the power to outpace her hands or to match her knowledge or to move through a medical crisis with her kind of instinctive grace. But the power of networks. The power of influence. The power of a carefully cultivated career that had positioned him to make phone calls that mattered. She had threatened his position once with a single quiet correction. She had exposed him to the possibility of being wrong. And now she was about to pay for that in every way that mattered. Sterling opened his computer and began to type an email to the hospital administrator. The words came easily. 23 years of political maneuvering had taught him exactly how to frame concerns about credentialing, about scope of practice, about the liability issues that hospitals faced when nurses practiced medicine. It was all true, in a technical sense. It was all documented. It was all necessary. By the time dawn broke over Denver, casting the ICU in that particular shade of grey that happened in hospitals at 0530, Margaret was already beginning her second 12-hour shift without knowing that her calendar was being erased. That the calls were being made. That every advantage she had built, her quiet competence, her reputation for excellence, her position as the night shift nurse that families requested, was being methodically dismantled by a man who had learned that the only threat to power was the emergence of someone more capable than you. She moved through the ICU with the same measured efficiency she always did, checking monitors, adjusting drips, speaking to patients in that low, calm voice that made even the dying feel less afraid. She didn't know that her file was being reviewed. That questions were being asked about her credentials. That Sterling was already making the calculations about who he could trust to validate his concerns, whose recommendation would carry weight with administration, which version of events would be most believable to people who had never worked a shift in their lives. The sergeant major watched her from his bed, his eyes tracking her movements with the recognition of someone who understood exactly what she was. What she had been. What she had sacrificed to become the woman who could move like that through a hospital corridor, invisible and essential, a ghost in scrubs who had learned that the best way to survive was to disappear entirely into the work. But Sterling saw her now. And seeing her meant destroying her was the only way to protect himself. The hospital was full of people who had no idea that the quiet nurse making rounds at 05:45 in the morning was about to become a casualty of ambition, a threat to be neutralized, a problem to be solved through the systematic dismantling of everything she had built in the quiet hours when no one was watching. The alarm screamed at 0300 like something alive and dying. Margaret was 2 floors down, finishing chart updates in the basement medical records office, when the overhead crackled. Code blue, ICU Bay 7. Her hands froze on the keyboard. Sergeant Major Patterson. She was moving before the page finished, boots hitting the stairwell at a run, taking steps 3 at a time, muscle memory overriding protocol. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as she climbed. The ICU was chaos when she reached the doors. Monitors wailed in discordant rhythm. The code team was already there, but something was wrong. Dead wrong. Patterson's chest heaved in the wrong pattern, his O2 saturation plummeting, 88, 82, 76. The resident fumbled with the crash cart. A nurse compressed his chest with mechanical desperation. But Margaret saw it instantly. The belly was rigid, distended, dark bruising spreading across the lower right abdomen like spilled wine on white cloth. Internal bleeding. Massive. Sterling was supposed to have caught that. Sterling had missed it. The attending, Dr. Reeves, not Sterling, turned to the resident. "Where's Sterling? Who cleared this patient for stable transfer?" No one answered. The room went dead silent except for the monitor's accusation. Margaret pushed through. Initial assessment missed abdominal trauma. Retroperitoneal bleed. He needs OR now. Reeves didn't ask who she was. He just nodded. Get vascular on the phone. Tell them we're bringing a GSW with active hemorrhage. Type and cross, for units. Move. Margaret was already moving. Her hands found the equipment without thought. She grabbed the 18-gauge angiocath, the wide bore for setup, her movements precise as a surgeon's. Muscle memory from 18 years before she was ever a nurse, from a forward operating base in Helmand Province where you learned to work under fire or you watched people die. The needle went in smooth. Blood backed up immediately, dark, venous, a river of it. She twisted the second line into Patterson's other arm while barking orders that sounded less like suggestions and more like commands, her voice dropping half an octave without permission. Type O negative, stat. 2 units wide open. Get me a second liter of normal saline. Prepare for massive transfusion protocol. The nurses moved. Not because Margaret had seniority. Because something in her voice made them listen like it was the difference between living and dying. Because it was. Patterson's wife stood in the corner, her hand pressed to her mouth. Margaret's eyes met hers for one fractional second, a look that said he's going to make it, before turning back to the bleeding. The sergeant major's blood pressure was 68/40. His core temp dropping. His body shutting down, system by system, a building collapsing in slow motion. The OR team was 90 seconds out. Margaret clamped the bleeder site with precision, her hand steady as surgical instruments, controlling the hemorrhage with a technique that required both knowledge and experience, the kind that comes from having done it before under conditions that would make most people freeze. By the time they wheeled Patterson toward the operating room, his vitals had stabilized enough to transport. Reeves squeezed her shoulder. Good work, Walsh. He didn't know. He had no idea that in that moment, Margaret Walsh had just saved the life of a Marine Sergeant Major using a field technique taught to her in 2006 by a SEAL Team 3 combat surgeon in a tent that still smelled like diesel fuel and copper. He had no idea that she'd done this before. That she'd saved 47 lives this way. That she carried the weight of every single one. By 0600, Sterling was awake. Someone had called him immediately after the code, the professional courtesy that doctors paid each other. And the moment he heard internal bleed, missed on your initial assessment, his mind had shifted into a gear that looked nothing like concern for the patient. It looked like survival. It looked like a man whose carefully constructed reputation was bleeding out just as fast as Patterson had been. The hospital corridor at 0630 was empty except for the smell of antiseptic and brewing coffee. Sterling sat in his office, door closed, phone in hand. The line rang once, twice, then picked up. Davidson. It's Sterling. We need to talk. His voice was smooth as ice. We have a serious liability issue at the hospital. A nurse, Margaret Walsh, works night shift ICU. She's been performing procedures way outside her scope of practice. Decompression techniques, emergency interventions. Without physician approval. Board member Davidson was his golf partner from the country club, the one who owed Sterling a favor from when he'd backed him for the hospital board position 3 years ago. Davidson's response came immediately, cautious but attentive. How serious? Serious enough that I'm wondering where she came from. She was hired through a temp agency. Her credentials are vague. There's a gap in her employment history. And tonight she performed a procedure that should have required physician authorization. Could be mental health related. Could be ego. Either way, she's a liability we can't afford. It wasn't a lie. It was careful architecture of the truth, each brick laid exactly where it needed to go to support the weight of a man's ambition. By 0730, Sterling had made 3 more calls. To Dr. Patterson at the medical board, unrelated colleague, dinner connections. To the compliance office. To the temp agency that had placed Margaret 18 months ago. His tone with each was professionally concerned, the voice of a man trying to protect his hospital from a genuine threat. A man of principle. The temp agency director, a woman named Susan Reeves who took her job seriously, was initially defensive. Dr. Sterling, I personally vetted Margaret Walsh. Her background check cleared. She came with references from. From where, exactly? Sterling's voice was patient, curious, the voice of a man just trying to understand. Because my chief of staff is wondering the same thing. She listed previous employment as a private nursing care, 2008 to 2014. We need actual facility names. Tax records. W2S. She's been practicing procedures that require credentials she may not actually have. Doubt is a plant that grows fast in institutional soil. By the time Sterling hung up, Susan Reeves had already decided to pull Margaret's file and initiate a credential verification hold. Standard procedure, she told herself. Completely routine. By 08:45, the hospital's external compliance investigator, a man named Hendricks, a retired hospital administrator who owed Sterling 3 professional recommendations and whose son was applying to medical schools that Sterling's reputation could sway, was sitting in Sterling's office. The door was closed. The blinds were drawn. Sterling had prepared a file, copies of Margaret's job application, the medical incident report from 2 weeks ago with his own notes added, a list of procedures performed without documented physician oversight, and a summary flagged with phrases like credential discrepancies, possible mental health episodes, and safety risk. "I want to help her," Sterling said, his face a perfect mask of concern. "But we have a duty to the hospital. If her background isn't solid, if she's hiding something about her past, we need to know. For everyone's safety." Hendricks nodded slowly. He'd seen this before. Or thought he had. "I'll start with her personnel file. We'll need employment verification from every place she lists. If there are gaps or inconsistencies, we'll need to address them." By 1000, the investigation was officially launched. Margaret was called to HR. The office was on the 3rd floor, small and neutral, the kind of space designed to feel professional and impersonal at the same time. Ms. Chen, the HR director, sat across from Margaret with a file open and a look of deep professional discomfort. Margaret sat perfectly still, hands folded, her voice level and even. "Margaret, I need to discuss some discrepancies in your employment history." Chen didn't meet her eyes. "Your resume shows a gap from 2008 to 2014. That's 6 years. We need documentation from you. Where were you working?" Margaret's breath came shallow but controlled. She'd known this was a risk when she took the job at Oak Creek, when she'd created the cover story, when she'd chosen Denver specifically because it was far enough from San Diego and Coronado that she could disappear into the anonymity of a mid-tier hospital and heal quietly. "I was nursing. Private work. We'll need references. Employment verification. Tax records from those years." Chen's voice was careful. "Dr. Sterling has raised some concerns about potential credential discrepancies. Nothing official yet, but we need to clear this up quickly." The walls were closing. Margaret could feel it happening in real time, the systematic architecture of a man pulling strings in the darkness. She'd been so careful. She'd been so invisible. And invisibility, she was learning, was only protection until someone decided you weren't supposed to be invisible anymore. "I can provide what I have," Margaret said, her voice still steady, but something underneath had changed. Something cold had woken up. The part of her that had known every contingency, every exit route, every weapon and weakness in any room she'd ever entered. "That would be helpful. We'll expedite this." Chen closed the file. "In the meantime, you're on a temporary reassignment. Administrative duties only, pending investigation completion. We'll have an update for you within 5 business days." Margaret stood. Understood. But even as she said it, she was already running calculations. Sterling had gotten serious fast, which meant he was scared. The truth was becoming a different shape, like light bending through water. But Sergeant Major Patterson was stable in the recovery room by 1400. And when he opened his eyes 6 hours later, the first thing he asked was about the nurse. The one who'd called out decomp technique like she'd done it in the field. The one who'd moved like she knew exactly what she was doing when everything was falling apart. "Tom," his wife said, holding his hand. "The doctor said she's under investigation. That she might have lied about her background." Patterson's eyes, still heavy with anesthesia, focused with sudden precision. "Call her back." "The nurse? I can't just..." "Ask for Margaret. Margaret Walsh. Tell her..." He paused, gathering strength. "Tell her I know what I saw." His wife looked confused. But she made a note. Because something in Tom Patterson's voice made it clear that he wasn't just a patient anymore. He was a witness. And witnesses changed things. In the basement medical records office, Margaret was filing charts she had no business filing, reassigned to make her invisible and containable while Sterling's machinery did its work. Her hands moved through the motions. Her mind was somewhere else. Working. Remembering. Calculating how many steps Sterling had taken and how many more he would need to take before he realized exactly who he was trying to destroy. The faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her old jacket was in a locker 3 floors above her. She could taste copper. Adrenaline. The feeling of blood on gloved hands in a forward operating base under fire. And underneath it all, something quiet and ancient and patient. The part of her that had survived exactly this kind of institutional warfare before. This was only the beginning. Security escort Morris held the cardboard box like it contained something radioactive. Margaret followed him down the corridor at 1,400 hours. She'd stopped thinking in civilian time the moment Sterling's retaliation began. The ICU nurses watched from the break room threshold. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody spoke. The silence was its own kind of violence, the sound of people choosing sides they'd never admit choosing. Ms. Chen from HR had trembled through the termination script. Due to irregularities in your credential verification and documented violations of hospital protocol, your employment is terminated effective immediately. Sterling stood in the corner with his arms folded, watching like a predator confirming the kill. Margaret had met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then said, "The Sergeant Major is alive because I saved him twice from mistakes you'll find in the chart review." She'd watched Sterling's jaw tighten. She'd watched him understand, for the first time, that she knew exactly what he'd done and exactly what it meant. But she hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't trembled. She'd simply stood, turned to Morris, and said, "I'm ready." The composure of someone who'd already survived worse. The calm of a person with nothing left to lose. The box contained her stethoscope with the worn earpieces she'd replaced 4 times. A photograph of Jake at age 7, gap-toothed and holding a fish at a mountain lake she'd taken him to once before the nightmares started coming every night. Her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, so small you'd never notice it unless you knew where to look. Morris had packed it without asking questions. He was a good man. She'd seen him 3 times a week for 8 months and they'd never exchanged more than greetings. That was how she'd built this life. Quiet. Invisible. Safe. The Denver afternoon was 73 degrees and bright enough to make her squint. The parking lot stretched ahead like a runway she'd never asked to walk. She could feel eyes on her from the 3rd-floor windows, the administrative offices where Sterling was probably already on the phone, his voice smooth as oil, explaining to board members why he'd had no choice, why her credentials were questionable, why the hospital had to protect itself. He was competent at this. Destruction wrapped in policy. Sabotage dressed up as procedure. She sat in her car for 17 minutes before turning on the engine. The steering wheel was still warm from the morning sun. She'd driven this same route exactly 247 times, she counted things now, had always counted things, but now she was counting the end of something. She'd chosen Denver because nobody here knew Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. Nobody here knew what she'd done in Kandahar. Nobody here would ask her why she'd survived when her entire team hadn't. That had been the deal she'd made with herself when she applied at Oak Creek, become nobody, heal quietly, let the scars fade in darkness. Jake was at the kitchen table when she walked through the door at 16:31. He was supposed to be at baseball practice. The cardboard box hit the tile floor with a wet, hollow sound, the stethoscope sliding toward the cabinet, the photograph face down. Mom. Jake was 14 and tall enough now that he had to look down slightly to meet her eyes. "Why are you home? What happened? Practice doesn't start until..." She couldn't speak. The tears came like a breach in a dam, like internal pressure finally finding its release point. Her hands shook as she sat down at the table, the same table where she'd helped him with algebra homework, where she'd pretended that a quiet job and a quiet life could be enough, that healing worked like a procedure, you do the steps, you follow protocol, you survive. Jake moved toward her. "Mom, please. What happened?" She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The tears kept coming. After 8 months, 14 days, and 6 hours at Oak Creek Memorial, after 247 drives through Denver traffic, after 18 years of teaching herself how to stop trembling during decompression procedures and how to hold steady while holding someone else's life in her hands, she couldn't find a single word that would make sense to a boy who'd never known his mother was anything but a quiet woman who worked the night shift. "I lost my job," she whispered. It was the first true thing she'd said in months. "They found out." I don't know what they found out, but they. She couldn't finish. The shame wasn't about being fired. It was deeper than that. It was about the secret she'd buried so carefully that even Sterling couldn't understand it. It was about the medals locked in the storage unit downtown that Jake didn't know existed. It was about the operations she couldn't discuss, the names of the dead she couldn't speak out loud, the 14 operators she'd held while they bled out on stretchers because the nearest surgeon was 40 minutes away and there was nothing she could do. Jake sat down across from her. He reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm from baseball, from being a normal 14-year-old boy in a normal American suburb with a mother who tried so hard to be normal for him. "You'll get another job," he said quietly. "You're the best nurse at that hospital. Everyone says so." "They don't know who I am," Margaret whispered. "They don't know anything about me." That was the truth that broke her. 8 months of rebuilding had been erased in a single afternoon because she'd done exactly what she'd been trained to do. She'd saved a life using hands and knowledge that no night shift nurse at a mid-tier Denver hospital was supposed to have. She'd performed a needle decompression so clean, so precise, so immediately effective that a Marine sergeant major had recognized it for what it was: combat medicine. The signature of someone who'd done it before. The kitchen was dark except for the light spilling in from the hallway. Rain had started falling outside, the kind that hammered against the windows like applause or accusation. Margaret sat in that darkness with her son's hand in hers, unable to explain why the woman who'd worked so hard to heal alone in Denver was now shattered across a kitchen table. Across the city, in a motel room off Spee Boulevard, Sergeant Major David Patterson of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines was on his phone, and his voice carried the weight of 18 years of memory. "I need you to run a name," he told Colonel Marcus Reeves over a secure line that had been routed through 3 Pentagon switchboards. "Margaret Walsh. Navy. Possibly retired. She worked at Oak Creek Memorial in Denver. She did a needle decomp on me, a perfect technique, 2 seconds flat, and the hospital just fired her for it." His voice dropped. "Sir, I know that technique. I've only seen it done that cleanly in Helmand. I think she's one of ours. I think she's Ghost." Colonel Reeves went very still. "You're sure?" "Positive." Patterson's jaw tightened. "And she's in trouble." 43 minutes later, Reeves picked up a red phone that hadn't been used in 4 years. The call went directly to a woman at the Pentagon whose job title didn't exist on any official document. Margaret sat in darkness at the kitchen table and held her 14-year-old son's hand, unaware that the quiet she'd chosen for herself was about to be shattered in ways she couldn't predict. The cardboard box lay on the floor. The unit patch, the last piece of her old identity, remained sewn inside the jacket lining, a secret waiting to become known. And then her phone rang. The next morning, Jake pushed open the door to Sterling's office like he was entering a war zone. His 14-year-old hands gripped the wooden edges of a shadow box, fingers trembling not from fear but from purpose. Inside, behind glass, lay the medals. The ribbons. The certificates that Margaret Walsh had spent 15 years trying to forget existed. She wasn't with him. She'd told him no, told him to let it go, told him some battles weren't worth fighting. He didn't listen. He never listened when it mattered. Mrs. Kovac, the hospital administrator, sat behind her desk reviewing termination paperwork when Jake entered. She looked up, ready to call security. Then she saw what he was carrying. Her reading glasses slipped down her nose. Jake's voice cracked like he was aging a decade in real time. "Mom, they need to see these." Kovac's hands reached for the shadow box. The weight of it seemed impossible for something made of wood and glass. She opened it slowly, Carefully, the way you open something that might explode. Her eyes moved across the citations. Her lips formed words that didn't initially make sound. Then she read aloud, her voice dropping into the kind of reverence reserved for the dead and the legendary. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. The name hung in the office air like a sacrament. Navy Cross. Kovac's hands began to tremble. She set the box down, afraid to drop it. 3 purple hearts. Each word landed like a defibrillator shock against Sterling's reputation. Combat Medical Support, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Field Trauma Innovations, adopted as standard protocol across Naval Special Warfare Command. Recommended for promotion 5 times. Declined promotion 5 times. Kovac looked at Jake. Her eyes were wet. She could have been an admiral. The office door swung open. Nobody knocked. Nobody asked permission. A Marine colonel entered in dress blue so pristine they looked like they'd never touched a human body, only the abstract concept of honor. His uniform carried decorations that told stories of wars most people would never see. Behind him stood 3 other figures, the board members. Davidson. Chen. Halloway. The same one Sterling had called at dawn yesterday, activated like sleeper assets in a coup, had assured him they'd support his investigation into Margaret's credentials. The same ones who'd promised him their votes. They weren't voting anymore. The colonel's voice had the texture of gravel run through a subwoofer, deep, precise, carrying the weight of absolute authority. He didn't need to raise it. Everyone in that room could hear him perfectly at half volume. He extended a handshake to Kovac, then turned to Sterling, who was still sitting at his desk, his face the color of hospital walls. Dr. Richard Sterling, I'm Colonel Marcus Reeves, United States Marine Corps. I served alongside Senior Chief Margaret Walsh during Operation Resolute Support in Kandahar Province, 2019 through 2021. She saved 14 of my Marines with nothing but her hands and her knowledge and a willingness to die if that's what the moment required. Reeves moved closer to the desk. Not threatening. Worse than threatening. Clinical. During that deployment, she innovated a field extraction protocol for tension pneumothorax using improvised equipment. That protocol saved 43 lives. It's now standard issue across Naval Special Warfare Command. Sterling's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The colonel continued, his words arriving like artillery fire, methodical, devastating, unstoppable. She has 3 purple hearts because she was shot twice and shrapnel wounded once while providing medical cover for extraction operations. She earned her Navy Cross for holding a Marine's internal organs together for 8 kilometers under fire while whistling to keep him conscious. She declined promotion 5 consecutive times because she wanted to stay downrange, staying close to the people she could help. Reeves turned toward the board members. Gentlemen. Ms. Chen. You called her a fraud. Davidson's face flushed the color of infection. His mouth opened. No words. Reeves continued without waiting for an answer. She's currently the 4th most decorated medical officer in the Navy Reserves, and she was working night shift ICU because she requested anonymity while processing PTSD from combat. She didn't advertise it. She didn't use it. She wore it the way warriors wear scars, quietly, with dignity, and with no expectation of recognition. The colonel looked directly at Sterling. You missed an arterial bleed during your initial assessment of Sergeant Major Patterson. Your negligence nearly killed him. A nurse with a medical background, you clearly don't respect, caught what you missed. Then you terminated her employment and filed a fraudulent investigation into her credentials because your ego couldn't accept being corrected by someone you decided was beneath you. Reeves paused. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming in their fixtures. That decision is about to cost you everything. Sterling stood. His knees buckled slightly. He gripped the desk like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I didn't know. She never said. Exactly, the colonel said. She never said. Because Senior Chief Walsh understands something you clearly don't. Character isn't what you shout about yourself. It's what you do when nobody's looking. It's who you are when the world isn't watching. Mrs. Kovacs' phone buzzed. Then Sterling's phone buzzed. Then everyone's phones buzzed almost simultaneously. The medical board. The state licensing authority. The legal department at Naval Medical Command. The message was the same across all channels: investigation initiated regarding Dr. Sterling's credentials, conduct, and breach of hospital protocol. 2 hours later, the same security guard who'd escorted Margaret from the hospital the previous day, a Morris, 30 years of service, a Vietnam-era veteran who recognized military bearing when he saw it, approached Sterling's office. The office that had been Sterling's palace, his throne room, his personal fiefdom for 17 years. Sterling was throwing things into a cardboard box with the frantic movements of a man watching his life compress into salvageable items. Morris set another cardboard box on the desk. His voice was level, professional, the voice of someone who'd secured worse situations than this. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." Sterling didn't look up. His hand shook so badly he dropped a diploma, watched it slide across the tile floor. Morris didn't pick it up. He simply left, closing the door quietly behind him. That quiet closing was worse than any slam. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in Mrs. Kovacs' office, different from Sterling's by everything that mattered. Natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows. Plants. Photos of Kovacs' own family. Real wood instead of veneer. The administrator looked across the desk at Margaret like she was seeing her for the first time, which she was. "Senior Chief Walsh, I'm authorized to offer you the position of Director of Trauma Surgery at Oak Creek Memorial. Full credentials validation by Naval Medical Command, completed this morning. Starting salary of $287,000 annually, with full authority over trauma protocol development, staff training, and department operations. You can write whatever additional terms you need." Margaret sat very still. Her hands rested flat on the desk like they were the only things keeping her anchored to the earth. She'd forgotten what power felt like. Not the power to hurt. The power to heal. The power to be seen for what you actually were. "The trauma unit," Margaret said. Her voice had changed. Somewhere between yesterday and today, it had dropped an octave, had picked up the cadence of someone accustomed to people listening. "I want to run the trauma unit. I want full protocol authority. And I want a Veterans Care Integration Program. PTSD screening at intake. Combat medical support services. Peer support networks." Kovac didn't hesitate. Didn't negotiate. "Done. I'll have legal draw up the contract today." Margaret nodded. Then she noticed something on Kovac's desk. The faded SEAL unit patch. The one sewn into her jacket lining. The one she'd carried through 2 continents and a decade of civilian life, the last thread connecting her to the person she'd been. Jake must have given it to Colonel Reeves. Reeves must have given it to Kovac as some kind of testimony. A physical piece of evidence that Margaret Walsh wasn't just someone who'd worked here quietly, she was someone who'd bled for people the world would never know. 6 months later, Margaret ran the trauma unit with the same efficiency she'd once used to save lives in burning dust and failing light. The sergeant major, completely healed, visited monthly. He called her chief. He always would. Her office held the framed unit patch on the wall. The photo of Jake on her desk. And new additions, commendation letters from SOCOM, from Naval Special Warfare Command, from the families of people she'd saved whose names she'd never known. In the break room, nurses competed to sit at her table now. The ostracism had reversed itself so completely it had become something like worship, though Margaret had no patience for that. She didn't want to be worshipped. She wanted to be useful. When a young veteran came in trembling, eyes haunted by things that didn't have names, Margaret recognized herself in that shaking. She took one measured breath and spoke in the low voice of someone who'd been where that person was. "You're safe now. That's what matters." The veteran's shoulders dropped. Something in them released. That was the work. That was always the work. 3 states away, Sterling taught CPR fundamentals to bored community college students for $18 an hour. His fingers moved through chest compressions on a dummy that never bled, never broke, never survived. He'd filed complaints with the board. Called every contact he had. The contacts who'd built his career all those years had stopped returning his messages somewhere around hour 4 of the revelation. His credentials were under review. His reputation was a crater. His future was cardboard boxes and community college and the quiet knowledge that he'd been so thoroughly beaten by someone he'd decided was beneath notice that the victory hadn't even required a fight. Margaret stood in the trauma unit one evening, reviewing protocols for a 14-year-old Marine medic candidate who'd been accepted into a new Navy program. She thought about where she'd been 48 hours ago. On a kitchen chair, crying, everything burning down. Now she stood in a place she'd built, with authority earned through 15 years of service that had nothing to do with credentials and everything to do with the kind of person you became when you chose to help instead of harm. She pulled the faded unit patch from its frame and held it for just a moment. The patch was worn thin in places, the edges frayed from years of being sewn and re-sewn. It smelled like old fabric and memory and the dust of Kandahar that never quite washed out of anything it touched. She set it back in its frame and returned to work. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe for more tales of quiet strength and hidden power. Like this video if you believe the real heroes often go unrecognized. And comment, have you ever underestimated someone only to discover you were standing next to a legend? Because sometimes they're not announcing who they are. They're just doing the work. They're just saving lives. And they're doing it in scrubs.